My husband hit me at dinner. His mother looked at me and said, I stayed. Don't make the same mistake. The slap came out of nowhere. 1 second, I was laughing at something my brother-in-law said about his new boat. The next, my head snapped sideways and the entire table went silent. My cheek burned. The wine glass I'd been holding shattered on the marble floor. Nobody moved. My husband, Derek, sat back in his chair like nothing happened, just reset his napkin on his lap, and picked up his fork. My mother-in-law, Patricia, took a careful sip of her Chardonnay. My father-in-law cleared his throat and asked someone to pass the bread. I sat frozen, waiting for someone to say something, anything. The conversation slowly resumed. Sports, weather, someone's promotion. My sister-in-law asked about vacation plans for next summer. Everyone ignored the shattered crystal, glittering on the floor beside my chair. Ignored the red handprint blooming across my face. I excused myself to the bathroom on shaking legs. My hands gripped the sink so hard my knuckles went white. The slap mark was already darkening across my cheek. An ugly red handprint that makeup wouldn't cover. 5 clear finger marks, evidence that couldn't be hidden. The bathroom door opened without a knock. Patricia walked in, closed it behind her, and leaned against it. She studied my face in the mirror, with the same expression she used when inspecting produce at the farmer's market spectacle, detached. You embarrassed him, she said simply, laughing too loud, drawing attention. Derek doesn't like that. I stared at her reflection, unable to process what I was hearing. This woman who'd always been so elegant, so composed, who wore pearls to breakfast and never had a hair out of place, who taught me how to fold napkins into swans, and which fork to use for salad. My son has a temper, she continued, adjusting her own pearl necklace. His father does, too. You saw how dinner continued. We don't make scenes. We certainly don't leave. She paused, her fingers still on her pearls. We endure. Her eyes met mine in the mirror. I stayed 42 years, she said quietly. 3 broken ribs, I told the doctor, came from a fall down the stairs. A fractured wrist, I blamed on tennis. The silence in the bathroom was absolute, broken only by the faint, muffled sound of laughter bleeding through the heavy mahogany door from the dining room. Patricia's hand dropped from her pearls. The immaculate mask of the society matriarch slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a woman deeply lined with decades of swallowed screams. Her eyes, usually cold and assessing, were hollow. She reached into her quilted Chanel clutch, her manicured fingers bypassing the lipstick and the powdered compact, and extracted a small, heavy brass key. She pressed into my palm, curling my trembling fingers around it. The metal was ice cold against my sweaty skin. I stayed, Patricia whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, finally stripping away the plural we. Don't make the same mistake. Before I could ask what the key belonged to, before I could even process the confession of her broken bones, Patricia turned on the gold-plated faucet. She wet a thick paper towel with warm water and handed it to me. Press this to your cheek. It will minimize the swelling. Use the La Mer foundation in my bag to color correct the red. Her voice had instantly reverted to the detached, perfectly modulated tone of a woman discussing floral arrangements. We are having roast duck for the main course. Derek hates it when the meat gets cold. She turned and walked out, the click of her heels echoing like a gavel striking wood. I stood alone, staring at the brass key in my hand. It had a tiny sequence of numbers engraved on the head, 704. I slipped it into my bra, pressing the warm paper towel to my burning face. My reflection looked like a stranger. A woman with a red, swelling handprint across her left cheek, her eyes wide like a cornered animal. Don't make the same mistake. I applied the thick concealer, dulling the violent red to a sickly, shadowed yellow. I took a deep breath, smoothing my dress, and walked back into the dining room. The shattered glass had been swept away. A fresh crystal goblet sat by my plate. Derek was mid-story, laughing about a golf handicap, his hands, the same hands that had just struck my face with enough force to snap my neck back, casually cutting into his duck. I sat down. Derek glanced at me, his eyes quickly scanning my face, noting the makeup. He gave me a brief, approving smile, the kind you give a dog that has finally learned to stay off the couch. Feeling better, darling? He asked. Much, I said, my voice eerily steady. I picked up my fork. I tasted nothing. I just chewed, swallowed, and watched them. My brother-in-law, Liam, swirling his wine. My sister-in-law, Chloe, laughing at Derek's joke. My father-in-law, Richard, carving his meat with surgical precision. And Patricia, taking a careful sip of her Chardonnay, never once looking my way. They were a family of monsters, bound together by the blood they spilled behind closed doors and the silence they bought with their wealth. For 2 years of marriage, I had thought I was part of a prestigious, loving dynasty. Tonight, the illusion hadn't just cracked, it had shattered on the marble floor alongside my wine glass. The drive home was suffocating. The rain lashed against the windshield of Derek's Range Rover, the rhythmic thud of the wipers serving as the only sound. "You pushed me, Elena," Derek said quietly as he pulled into our driveway. The engine cut off, plunging us into the quiet dark. He didn't look at me. His hands remained at 10 and 2 on the leather steering wheel. "You know I hate being interrupted when I'm speaking." And laughing like a hyena at Liam's idiotic boat. It was humiliating. "You embarrass me." "I'm sorry," I said. The words tasted like ash, but I knew what the script required. Survival meant submission. "For now." Derek sighed, unbuckling his seatbelt. He reached over and gently cupped my unbruised cheek. His thumb stroked my jawline. "I love you, you know that. I just need you to be better. To be the woman I know you can be." "I will," I whispered. He leaned in and kissed my forehead. "Good girl. Let's go inside." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the slow, even rhythm of Derek's breathing. I felt the hard edge of the brass key hidden inside the lining of my jewelry box on the nightstand. I realized then that escaping Derek wouldn't be as simple as packing a bag and calling a taxi. Derek was a senior partner at Whitman and Sons Capital. He had money, connections, and a terrifying temper. If I just ran, he would hunt me down. He would freeze my accounts, hire private investigators, and drag me back. Or worse, to leave a man like Derek, I couldn't just walk away. I had to destroy the cage. Derek left for the firm at 7 a.m. the next morning. I waited until his taillights disappeared down the winding road of our gated community before I moved. I took an Uber to the commercial district, avoiding my own car in case Derek had installed a GPS tracker, a paranoia that had suddenly bloomed in my mind, born of his constant need to know my schedule. The brass key belonged to an independent, high-security private vault facility downtown. No bank names, no corporate logos. Just a blank glass door and an armed guard. I presented the key to the clerk. "Box 704, the clerk said, checking a ledger. "Name?" I froze. Patricia hadn't told me what name the box was under. I took a wild guess, remembering Patricia's maiden name from a family tree she had once proudly shown me. "Eleanor Vance." The clerk nodded and gestured for me to follow. Inside the steel-lined viewing room, I placed the heavy metal box on the table and opened it. I let out a sharp breath. The box was filled with neat, rubber-banded stacks of $100 bills. At least $200,000 in untraceable cash. Beside the money lay a thick, leather-bound journal, 2 USB flash drives, and a navy blue passport. I opened the passport. It had my photo, pulled from my driver's license, likely, but a completely different name, Clara Hughes. I picked up the leather journal. The handwriting was Patricia's, meticulous and elegant. But the contents were anything but refined. It was a master ledger. For over 3 decades, Patricia had been documenting the illegal activities of her husband, Richard, and eventually, her son, Derek. Page after page detailed offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, massive tax fraud, embezzlement from their own clients, and the bribes paid to local politicians to secure real estate zoning rights. The USB drives, according to a note stuck to the cover, contained the digital proof: emails, bank transfers, wire receipts. I started collecting this as an insurance policy. The first page read, "I thought one day I would be brave enough to use it. But a bird born in a cage thinks flying is an illness. My wings are broken. Yours are not. Use this. Burn them to the ground." Tears pricked my eyes. Patricia hadn't just given me an escape route. She had handed me a loaded gun aimed squarely at the heart of the Whitman family empire. But there was a catch. The final entry in the journal, dated only 2 weeks ago, noted that Richard and Derek had recently moved the bulk of their illicit funds into a new, heavily encrypted shell company. The master password to access and drain the accounts was kept on an encrypted hardware key, a specialized digital fob. "Derek keeps it on his keychain," Patricia had written. "He never takes it off." I packed the cash, the drives, and the passport into my tote bag. I left the journal in the box, locked it, and walked out into the crisp autumn air. My cheek throbbed under my makeup, but for the first time since the dinner, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like an executioner. The game of cat and mouse began. Over the next 3 weeks, I played the role of the perfect, chastised wife. I baked Derek's favorite meals. I wore the dresses he picked out. I kept my voice soft, my laughter muted. Derek thrived on my submission. He bought me a diamond tennis bracelet as a reward for my improved behavior. I wore it, suppressing the urge to vomit every time the cold stones touched my skin. I met Patricia only once during this time, at a crowded charity luncheon. We sat at the same table, surrounded by the wealthy elite of the city. We didn't look at each other directly. "He's planning to move the money to Switzerland by the end of the month," Patricia murmured, pretending to adjust her napkin. Once it's there, the SEC won't be able to touch it. You are running out of time. I need his keychain, I whispered, taking a sip of water. I just need 10 minutes alone with his laptop and the digital fob. He plays squash with Liam on Thursday nights, Patricia said smoothly. He leaves his keys and his gym bag in the locker room. But the locker is padlocked. I'll figure it out, I said. Thursday night. The country club. I knew the layout well. While Derek and Liam were sweating on the courts, I slipped into the men's locker room. It was deserted, the heavy scent of cedar and expensive cologne hanging in the air. I found Derek's locker. Using a set of lockpicks I had bought online and practiced with for days, my hands shook as I worked the tension wrench. Click. The padlock popped open. Inside was his leather gym bag. I dug through it, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Finally, my fingers closed around his heavy silver keychain. Attached to it was a small, black titanium fob. I pulled out a specialized cloning device I had purchased with Patricia's cash, a high-tech tool designed to copy RFID and encrypted hardware tokens. I plugged the fob into the device. The progress bar on the tiny screen seemed to crawl. 10%, 30%. Footsteps echoed in the tiled hallway outside. Deep voices. Laughter. They were finishing their game early. 60%, 80%. I told you, you've got to follow through on the backhand. Liam's voice boomed, getting closer. 90%, 100%. Copied. I yanked the fob out, tossed the keys back into the bag, snapped the padlock shut, and practically threw myself into the adjacent towel closet just as the locker room door swung open. I stood in the pitch-black closet, breathing through my nose, surrounded by the smell of bleach and fresh cotton. I listened as Derek and Liam showered, dressed, and finally left. When the coast was clear, I slipped out of the club, clutching the cloned digital key in my pocket like a talisman. The execution of the plan was scheduled for the following Friday. It was the night of Richard and Patricia's 43rd wedding anniversary. The entire family was to gather at the Whitman estate, a sprawling, imposing mansion of stone and glass that looked more like a fortress than a home. At 2 a.m. the night before, while Derek was deep in a bourbon-induced sleep, I crept into his home office. I booted up his laptop. The password screen appeared. I plugged in my cloned fob. The screen blinked, and access was granted. I worked quickly, my fingers flying over the keyboard. I inserted Patricia's USB drives and began compiling a master dossier. I merged her 30 years of scanned documents, handwritten ledgers, and offshore routing numbers with the live data on Derek's laptop. The scope of their crimes was staggering. They had ruined hundreds of lives, foreclosed on families, gutted pension funds, bribed judges. It was a masterclass in corporate sociopathy. I didn't just copy the files. I set a trap. I drafted an automated email, attaching the encrypted zip file containing all the evidence. I addressed the email to the head of the SEC, the local FBI field office, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the financial editors of 3 major newspapers. I set the email to send automatically at exactly 8 p.m. the next evening, right in the middle of the anniversary dinner. I shut down the laptop, erased my tracks, and slipped back into bed beside the man who had hit me. I stared at his back in the dark. Sleep well, Derek, I thought. It's your last night in silk sheets. The Whitman dining room was a theater of opulence. A massive crystal chandelier cast a warm, golden glow over the long mahogany table. Silver cutlery gleamed. Crystal glasses sparkled. A team of hired servers moved silently around us, pouring vintage wine and serving courses of caviar and roasted quail. I sat in my usual spot, to Derek's right. Liam and Chloe were across from us. Richard sat at the head of the table, presiding over his empire, with Patricia at the opposite end. Patricia wore a stunning emerald green gown. And her pearls. Her posture was flawless. She caught my eye for a fraction of a second, raising an eyebrow. I checked my watch. 7:55 p.m. To 43 years, Richard said, raising his glass. His face was flushed with wine and arrogance. To the Whitman legacy. We've built an empire, and we've kept it strong. Nothing breaks this family. Here, Derek said, raising his glass. He placed a heavy, possessive hand on my thigh, squeezing tightly enough to bruise. I forced a smile and raised my glass. 7:58 p.m. The conversation turned to Liam's new boat again. The very subject that had triggered Derek's rage weeks ago. I'm telling you, Derek, you should bring Elena out on the yacht next weekend, Liam was saying, cutting into his quail. The weather is supposed to be perfect. Elena gets seasick, Derek said dismissively, though he had never once asked me if I did. Besides, we have a charity gala to attend. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. Actually, Derek, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the table. I don't get seasick at all. I'd love to go. The table went dead silent. The servers paused. Derek's hand on my thigh went rigid. He turned his head to look at me, his eyes narrowing into cold, black slits. It was the exact look he had given me right before he struck me last time. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. "Excuse me?" Derek said, his voice dropping an octave. I said, "I'd love to go," I repeated, turning to face him fully. I didn't shrink. I didn't break eye contact. 8 p.m. Richard frowned. "Derek, handle your wife." Derek's face contorted with rage. He shifted his weight, his right shoulder dropping slightly as he prepared to backhand me, completely unconcerned about our audience. He knew they would look away. He knew they would eat their quail in silence. But before his hand could leave his lap, a sharp ding echoed through the dining room. Then another. Then 5 more, in rapid succession. Derek paused, confused. The sounds were coming from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. At the same time, Richard's phone began ringing violently on the side table. Liam's phone buzzed aggressively against the mahogany wood. The symphony of alarms and notifications shattered the tension. Irritated, Derek pulled out his phone. "What the hell is?" His voice trailed off. I watched the color rapidly drain from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty chalk. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he read the screen. "Derek." Richard snapped, holding his own phone to his ear. "Derek, who the fuck is leaking our routing numbers? I just got an alert from Geneva. Our primary offshore accounts have been frozen." "Dad." Derek choked out, his hands shaking so violently his phone rattled against his plate. "They just forwarded me an email. They have everything. The ledgers. The shell companies. Everything." "That's impossible," Liam shouted, standing up, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "The encryption. It was bypassed." Derek yelled, his perfect facade crumbling into blind panic. He looked around the room wildly, breathing like a cornered animal. "Someone cloned the key. Someone got into my computer." Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the dining room swung open. The hired servers stepped back in alarm. Standing in the doorway were 6 men and women in dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in stark yellow across the back. Local police officers flanked them, their hands resting cautiously on their belts. "Richard Whitman?" "Derek Whitman," the lead agent said, stepping into the room, holding up a stack of warrants. "You are under arrest for securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy." Chaos erupted. Chloe screamed. Liam tried to run toward the kitchen but was immediately slammed against the wall by 2 officers. Richard collapsed into his chair, clutching his chest, his face purple, sputtering indignantly about his lawyers. Derek remained frozen in his seat. He slowly turned to look at me. The realization dawned in his eyes, slow and agonizing. He saw the calmness in my posture. He saw the lack of surprise on my face. "You," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. "You did this." He lunged at me. He raised his fist, letting out a guttural roar, determined to beat me one last time, to exert his dominance even as his world burned down around him. But I didn't flinch. I didn't cower. I stayed perfectly still in my chair. Before he could bridge the gap, an FBI agent tackled him from behind, driving him face first into the mahogany table. The impact shattered his crystal wine glass, sending sharp fragments of glass raining down onto the floor. Derek groaned, his face pressed against the polished wood, his arms wrenched behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed loudly over the shouting. I looked down at the shattered crystal glittering on the floor by my chair. It looked exactly like it had a month ago. I calmly reached for my napkin, reset it on my lap, and looked down the length of the long table. Through the chaos, past Liam being read his Miranda rights, past Richard hyperventilating as paramedics were called, past Derek thrashing weakly against the federal agents, I found Patricia. She sat perfectly still at the head of the table. She wasn't looking at her husband or her sons.
She was looking at me.
Slowly, deliberately, Patricia reached up to her neck. She unclasped the string of heavy, expensive pearls that she had worn every day for 40 years. The clasp clicked open. She let the necklace slide off her skin, pooling onto the table next to her half-eaten plate of quail. She raised her glass of Chardonnay. I raised my glass of red. We didn't say a word. We didn't need to. We just took a sip, the taste of the wine finally sweet, as the men who had demanded our silence were dragged out of the room screaming.